Welcome to the Essay Authors Podcast series. My name is Mdu Ntuli, your host and your fellow book lover. Today, I am very excited and honored and thrilled to be speaking to the very impressive, incredible Litha Hermanus on his book, his debut novel, The Eyes of the Naked. Before I speak to Litha and let him introduce himself a bit further, I would just like to say a few things. So Litha is a father, and Litha is a husband. And even though this is your debut novel, but Litha has been a media professional for many years, has been on radio, has been a presenter, has been a producer on radio, and also has been a teacher, a language teacher. And also Litha is the kind of man that one looks up to. And I think in this interview, we're going to discover why I make that statement, that for me, he's the type of person I would look up to. And so before I let you speak, Litha, I would just like to read an excerpt from The Eyes of the Naked. All right, so this is going to be on page 16, and I'll start on page 15, at the very end of page 15. Quote, had Thulani and Mojafela been arrested? Did the police know they killed Morinaga? And what about Dr. Amoa? Was he dead or just hurt? All of this, Nagedi had no way of knowing. Amid the chaos, he'd fled on foot from the crime scene in Windsor East, leaving his shuttle bus in the driveway. He ran under the cover of night, his escape aided by a series of broken street lamps. He'd come away with nothing save the clothes on his back and the small sling bag tucked under his armpit, Wesley's money. He cut his way through the streets of Linden and raced all the way down to the Victory Park Shopping Center. Under the light of the bridge across the street from the center, he checked to see whether he was hurt. I'm going to stop there. Wow. So, and then just before I let you, so to explain a little bit further, after becoming embroiled in a robbery, Nagedi Solomon flees to Mthatha, taking his son with him without his ex-wife's knowledge. But the Eastern Cape offers no refuge. His young brother has run away from home, possibly to a suspicious circumcision school. Drawn into the hunt for his sibling while he evades the law, Nagedi will smash into his history and the norms of society and culture to ask, what does it mean to be a man, to be a father? On this unexpected journey, a new consciousness awakens inside of him. Litha Hermanus, welcome. It's such a pleasure.
Sir. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Before we go any further, could you just introduce yourself to us? Tell us about yourself. Who is Litha Hermanus, who looks very different from the cover of his novel?
Well, I suppose, wow, there's a lot to say there. It's always a difficult question to answer in terms of who one is. Perhaps let me begin with what I am not, based on a couple of things that you already said. You said I was a radio presenter, which I was not. I was a co-presenter at best, because I used to be part of a four-man format. So I'm always quite careful to not, parade myself as a radio presenter, because people really work hard to get into that position where they are in charge of their own shows. So I was part of a four-show format, and that's why I'm only a co-presenter and not a presenter. Another thing you said was, man, you look up to. One, you have to be very, very short to look up at me. In terms of other reasons why people look up at other people or look up to other people, I'm always a little loath to say, I'm that guy that people should or can look up to. Of course, in certain instances I am, and in certain instances I'm not, but it's just something that I am always careful to not foreground, although you will say why, it is that position that you take. And then I suppose next is for me to address what I why I look like this, right? As opposed to looking like, let me just get a cover.
Yes, at the back of the book. Yes.
There we go. There's me.
Yes.
And
But
this is sort of the character I am in right now
yes.
for reasons I will explain.
Yes, I would love to.
I might as well take this off as well, you know, because it's making me hot. It's one thing to be in character, and then it's another thing to kill yourself. You know, I've even got wet wipes here so people can see me when I'm done, you know, what I actually look like.
Yes.
But Litha Hermanus is different depending on who you ask. But I'm a guy from the Eastern Cape, born and bred in what used to be the Transkei, the capital, Tata. You know, I grew up and had a fairly urban, Tata being a small town is still urban though. You know, I had a fairly urban upbringing, although I did have, up until I was 10, 12, I did have quite a bit of time spent in the rurals with my grandparents, you know, on holidays. So I do have a touch of the rural life, which I've kind of forgotten over the years with the separation from that space. But I am that kind of person. So meaning I'm very South African and African South African, you know, Xhosa South African. However, I come from a Sotho heritage.
Mm.
That has kind of been lost in the sauce, if you know what I mean, as far as my family is concerned, because my name is Litha, the second is Xhosa, and the second one is Tsepo, which is Sotho, and then my last name is Hermanus, which is Afrikaans. And so how you merge all of these things together is, you know, is something to me that has always kind of been disconcerting about my own identity, while at the same time it's been something that's been cause for me to understand that identity is not something that is fixed and something that is rigid, you know, because a lot of people, you know, who have I'll quote examples of friends who during Heritage Day a few days ago were able to say, I am Xhosa, I come from these people and these people. So, you know, dating their whole lineage back, you know, to hundreds and hundreds of years before. I'm one of those people in South Africa who cannot do that at all, let alone do it with confidence. And so I'd say Litha is an amalgamation of, I suppose, what I've already said about, you know, my rural past, but also I've also been somebody who's been able to travel the world, see various countries, eventually living in one for about 3.5 years, which is Japan.
Mm.
And so, you know, I'm just a dude. I'm just a guy, you know, who tries to write, who tries to make sense of the world, who tries to understand, you know, where he is in his own particular life, but also the country as well as the world. So I'm just a guy who's reading the world, and in reading the world, I put together words, you know, that end up writing the world, but it's really in reading the world.
And I think actually that is the right description, because we are universal citizens. We have to allow ourselves to think of ourselves as universals. You are a citizen of the universe. So
Correct.
even though you are in a black African body, but you as the real you are a citizen of the universe. So
Correct.
I like that explanation. And then let's delve into the eyes of the naked, and particularly the story of Nagedi. Firstly, the question, I have a set of questions, but I wanted to ask, is this autobiographical? Because as I was reading the novel, I saw certain parts of Nagedi's life that I found in your life. Firstly, he was at some point he worked with the aeroplanes. He was a cabin steward. And he also at some point used the alias name of Tsepo, which was very interesting. He has a son, again, very interesting. And his ex-wife works in media. So I thought, oh, is this autobiographical?
Right. Listen, they always say, write about what you know, particularly in your first novel. And so I wouldn't say the book is autobiographical at all. However, I mean, I do have a son. My son is 3 years old. Nagedi's son is 6. So those are, you know, totally different people. When I was writing the book, I mean, I began writing the book in 2014. My son was nowhere in sight. He was only born 3 or 4 years into my writing the novel. So it had nothing to do with him really, although his presence in the world did color my writing with a certain, I'd say, pathos that I didn't have before. Or, you know, there was a certain reach. When you're an uncle and you have a 6-year-old son, like I did, you know, and you try to get the mannerisms and try to get their language, you know, those are things that are external that you can get, but a parent's feeling towards a child is something that you cannot, you know, sort of get from the outside. That's something that's very internal. And I think that feeling really permeated my words in as far as writing about the boy in the book was concerned, after I became father and could relate. To answer your question in a more direct way, when I'm due, I think the only part of this book I would say that is autobiographical to a certain degree is the angst that the character has with having a westernized existence and trying to sort of collate that with an African cultural existence that is slipping away all the time. And so particularly with the traditional circumcision issue, I have, you know, I have a push and pull in my heart regarding, you know, the entire tradition, my place in it, the inadequacies that I might feel when I'm with certain more certified people within the tradition versus somebody who is like me, who is not fully certified. So the exploration of that feeling is definitely something that is embedded deeply, you know, within everything that I am. But, you know, that's probably the only thing that I would say directly reflects with my life, although that has been taken and put right in the middle of a pacey novel, you know?
And yes, it's very pacey. And then how did you come up with the title, The Eyes of the Naked? And also, it's two questions. So how did you come up with the title? And then also, how did the character of Nagedi come to you?
Okay. So the title is no easy story. This book has an existence as a work of fiction that I was writing for publication, but it also has an existence as an academic work that was written within a university context for a master's, okay? And so in writing the book, it was developed in its master's format. And I remember joining this master's group with 12 other writers. This is the first time I had other people who were going to read my work besides family, who often came back with a, yeah, no, your stuff is good, but could never offer any technical, you know, help that would make sure that I became a better writer. So I moved in, you know, into, or rather I joined this WITS Masters in Creative Writing course. And in joining it, I remember, you know, I was very excited, and we were going back and forth talking about the titles of our books and what this book was going to be like. And so my title, which had been living in my head, because I was writing this book for maybe a year now and a bit in my head before I actually committed it to paper. And the title of the book was supposed to be 2 words put together. A portmanteau word is what they call it. It was supposed to be violence and land. It was supposed to be Violand. You know, sounds a bit like violence, but, you know, violent land. I remember saying this title to everyone, and everyone just cracking up at me, talking about how it sounded like a B-grade movie and how I should stay away from that title, you know. But it made sense to me because, to me at least, the book was primarily about violence. Okay. I mean, it's one thing that you see this face and you see this face on the cover, but the book was primarily about violence. Please remind me to speak about the themes as in comparing them to a cell phone a little bit later. I don't want to mix that with what I'm saying now.
Okay.
But, you know, the book tackles a lot of violence. Silent violence is like hunger. You know, there's hunger in impoverished communities like shanty towns or squatter camps. There's violences, like, actual domestic violence. There's rape,
Yes.
there's robbery, I mean, even the main character himself is embroiled in something. So I wanted to,
Yes.
to explore it from that level initially. But as I spent time writing it, and after being laughed at, obviously, and then spend time writing it and uncovering some of what it was growing into, it eventually, led me to the title, The Eyes of the Naked, because I don't know if you're aware of the emperor, I think it's Emperor's Tale.
Yes.
About the naked emperor who nobody would say was naked because, it wasn't the right thing, to say. And then in the end, everybody sort of pretended that, he was fully dressed even though he was naked.
Yes.
So this title sort of speaks to, because in the end, it didn't only end up being about violence, but it ended up being about many South African themes, most of which, however, show us to be a little impoverished in many areas. It's not a book that really talks about how great South Africans are, or how great South Africa is. It talks about how great we could be, but really how we hold ourselves back, how we are naked, but our eyes don't in fact see that we are naked in most instances. I mean, for example, just, the other day we were told, go dance to Jerusalem, and we all decided we're going to go dance to Jerusalem and forget that there was 500 billion, that was squandered, for example, recently. The things that we focus on as a country, like it's a title that sort of explores that notion.
Yes, that's very interesting. In fact, you touch on the president in this book as well. And now maybe if we have time, I'll read a passage from there. But I have to tell you, Litha, the way you wrote the book was so impressive. It was so easy to read. And the way the chapters are put together, they are nice and compact and short. So it doesn't feel like a burden to get through chapter after chapter. Before you know it, the chapter is over and now it's the next chapter. And so, but also the intricacies that you were able to intertwine within this very fast-paced story. It was really exciting to read it. It's heavy, the story is heavy. What Nakedi goes through is very heavy. The twists and turns sometimes make you dizzy. And what Kele, his ex-wife, also goes through is very heavy. Now that, for me, there was the violent part that was frightening. The violence that Nakedi was experiencing was not as frightening, it was interesting. But what Kelly was going through, that frightened me. That part of those chapters, I found them, and I was reading the book at night most of the time. And I found myself really frightened, but excited at the same time. So I have to commend you for how the flow of the book, really excellent. It would be very easy, even for someone who's not a beast reader like I am, but someone who reads now and then, they'll find this book very easy to get into, and to just, before you know it, it's over. And it's like that movie, you're like, oh, it's over already, and you want more and you want more. So well done on that, I have to say. So can you said I must remind you about the themes of the cell phone. What did you mean by that?
Oh, okay. I'll get to that now, but I think I hadn't answered your question about Nagedi and how he sort of comes about. And
yes, please answer that. Absolutely.
Yes. Nagedi is really, for me, at some point, I wanted to write a book that spoke about fatherhood and the lack thereof. Perhaps maybe it's easy for me to start at the cell phone thing. Let me start at the cell phone thing. I tried to write a book without necessarily picking up themes to write about. I mean, the original theme that had come to me was violence. But I also know that in real life, we don't abstract things and deal with them separately. We deal with life as it comes. And in your mind, then you're able to abstract one thing and sort of work it out in your mind. But I'm not able to stop one thing from happening while I deal with the other in the real world, right? Or while I deal with something else. And so everything happens all at one go. I'll make an example with a cell phone like this. If you've got a cell phone in your hand, or I've got a tablet over here, I mean, it's made of many different parts, correct?
Yes.
Well,
mine,
in there, wow, look at that. So there's definitely springs in that. So there could be copper in there. I don't know if cobalt goes into phones. Whatever plastics go into phones. I'm not an engineer, so I'm not going to tell you exactly, what materials go into cell phones. But when you pick up a cell phone in the end, you don't say, you know, I'm holding a glass screen with a circuit board inside with plastic padding for the keypad, etc. You say you're holding a phone because all these different elements have worked themselves into, or have been worked rather by engineers and whoever else, into a single unified product which you use for particular things. The same thing with this book. I mean, I wasn't trying to, I mean, we have this circumcision or manhood theme, we have a violence theme, we have identity theme. So we have all of these things, even some other themes I won't mention now. But my idea for writing was to write in such a way that these things don't stand out each by themselves in a jarring way. It was in essence to sort of have a few balls that you're juggling in the air from the beginning of the novel and juggling them successfully in a very unjarring way up until the very end, such that when somebody reads, they don't read and go, oh, that theme sticks out and this is the theme you get throughout the whole book, but rather they get a fullness of life through the whole book, and certain themes come up just as they would, you know, in somebody's real life. So that's the kind of the phone analogy that I wanted to make. And Nagedi, the character, comes around for me as an attempt to investigate manhood. You know, I was writing this book into a space where manhood was already problematic. But I think through the years in which I wrote it, even up until it was published, we are, I would say, at a place where I would really say there's a crisis, particularly for African manhood, not even in the traditional Xhosa sense, but, you know, just manhood when it comes to violence, when it comes to not being a good dad, etc., etc. And not being a good father, even though I was writing about Nagedi and writing about his own father, and I wasn't trying to write about all South African males or all Black people, or, you know what I mean? I was only writing this thing, looking at it as, okay, I would like to look at my own life and sort of how it's worked out in terms of my own identity with manhood, in terms of my own experience with how manhood was passed on to me. And so I looked at Nagedi and I said, you know what, he's somebody, I want him to somebody who has not received any instruction on how to be a man. In terms of his father is someone who, by the time Nagedi is, you know, is able to understand him, is somebody who is very distant, somebody who is broken by the mines. I mean, we can think about Andebele's The Cry of Winnie Mandela, for example, talking about how, you know, migrant labor used to happen, and then, well, still happens now, but particularly under apartheid, and going particularly into the mine economy, and how people used to go into the mines and never come back, leave their families in the rurals of the Eastern Cape, or you know, the Venda area, or Ciskei, whichever homeland. And they would go into that space, find new families, stay away from their families where they came from. Before you know it, they're coming back with kids, etc., or they come back broken, either with lung disease, depending on which mines they worked in, or just maybe broken or injured. So Nagedi's father is somebody who's never been able to be a father to him. So he's broken by society in a variety of ways. And obviously society breaks you, but you always have your own, I suppose, role to play, you know, whether to accept being broken or to carry on forward, going in a direction that is positive for you. But Tolo, Nagedi's father, is somebody who was broken and is unable to find himself and collect himself enough to be able to help the next generation, particularly Nagedi, his son. And so Nagedi ends up growing without a father who instructs him in who he was, where he comes from, what it is to be a good father, what it is to not be a good father, how you're supposed to find your way, what the pitfalls are that lead someone to not be a good father. I mean, these are some of the things that I wish I had talked about, you know, with my own dad, who was a good father at some point in his life, particularly when, you know, when we were way younger. You know, I remember flights with him. I remember, you know, trips with him on a plane. But I also remember, you know, later on, you know, as I was growing up, like some really horrific things, like violence he would meet out towards my mom, or his absences, or his inability to break life down to us and whatnot. So, that's sort of something that I wanted to uncover, and Nagedi became the perfect vehicle for that because, I allowed him to be, I guess. I just
Mm,
gave him the name Nagedi because he's not a good dad, at least when the thing starts.
mm.
And Nagedi, if in Sesotho or Setswana, you know what Nagedi means. But I'll leave that up for the readers to find out. But I
Yes,
named
we
him
can't
Nagedi
give away too much.
too much. So I named him Nagedi in particular because of his role um, as a man, just within manhood, not necessarily traditional manhood, but where he is in terms of, does he take responsibility of himself, and once he
Mm,
has a son, does he take responsibility of his son, on a personal
mm,
level.
mm.
Yeah, I don't know if I've answered you. I tend to
Yes.
ramble on. Yeah.
No, in fact, you went on to answer the question I had planned to ask you next, which was, in this novel, you touch on the sacred, and I think this is a sacred custom of circumcision, especially within the Abaxhosa and the Sotho people, not so much the Zulus. I'm Zulu. Ntuli is a Zulu surname, so we see it differently. But certainly within the Xhosas, it's sacred. And so I was asking, what is your intention for using this custom in this novel? Is it as a coming of age story for Nagedi and his brother, because there's a younger brother as well in the story? And then, but also, are you saying it's a coming of age of manhood in general? Because we live in an age where men, I would say, are confused. Some are raised by single mothers, and mothers are wonderful. I was raised by a single mother as well. But then you have to try and figure out, how do I relate to men? How do I survive, or how do I thrive in the world of men? My mother can't teach me how to be successful in the world of men. So how do I figure that out? And what experiences do I have to go through in order to figure that out? And so sometimes you find that people discover their manhood later in life. And so they go through experiences that maybe when you were a teenager, you're supposed to have gone through this, or when you were in your early 20s, you're supposed to go through this. But because you then begin the process late, then you discover your manhood late. So that was the question that I really wanted to ask you, is that, are you speaking about men? Are you speaking about us in general, not just Nagedi and his brother? But you, in a way,
Um.
yeah, yes.
Sure. Listen. Again, I think I'm always a little worried when it comes to speaking for people. So I cannot speak for people. I can really
Mm,
speak about my own experiences, or experiences that I see or perceive and then turn over in my own mind. But I can never really say I speak for men because men are this or men are that. And so this was really, I think, this part of it, this traditional manhood bit, was really an exploration of my own angst around being a man who's in Johannesburg. Nobody asks me about my manhood, or in Pretoria, nobody asks me about my manhood. You know, I'm able to be a man because I pee standing. Well, not because of that only, but I'm able to be a man because of physical male attributes. But once I go into a traditional Xhosa setting, then I have to express my manhood in particular ways. And some of those ways I'm found wanting in. So, for example, if we talk about my own circumcision experience, my parents had a big fight, for example, when I was 17 and supposed to go into the bush to go and get circumcised. My mom at the time, HIV was, was raging pretty much within the practice. People were circumcising initiates and using the same instrument without sterilization. So my mom was pretty much aware of that and afraid of that. And so she appealed to my dad that we don't go in that direction in terms of like having a really traditional surgeon and having, the kind of circumcision, experience that would put us at risk either of HIV or just being botched by someone who, you know, was not accountable to anybody else if they made a mistake. So this was my
And
my mom's,
that's the
right? And
fear
then
that many parents have.
yeah, that's, and then my father's view was somewhat similar, but because he lived within a community of men who had other sons, and those men were more traditional men than my father, because my father is also a Hermanus, you know. He's not someone who was raised up in an extremely traditional manner. But I think when he got older, he was unable to justify with some of his more traditional friends why his boy wouldn't do the same thing that, you know, his friends' boys were doing. And so that became a very big argument in my house. So I remember approaching the age of circumcision where there was a fight in the house almost all the time about, no, this boy is not going this way, this boy is going this way. And I remember feeling some sort of way about it, because also as soon as I hit the public, or as soon as I ran into my peers, some of my peers were going in what they call the authentic way of circumcision. And some of my peers, you know, were going to the hospital as my mother was choosing for me to go. And so being in public, I mean, there was a thing at home, but also being in public, I had to justify with my own peers which side I was choosing and why. And obviously, if you choose a side that goes with hospital, then you are less of a man in other people's eyes. And if you choose the side that, you know, that goes with the traditional surgeon and everything that comes with it, then you are, you know, you're a stauncher man, even in the eyes of the people who have, say, gone to hospital for the circumcision. So for me, it was always kind of like a thing in my head, you know, where do I really fit? I'm no longer allowed in certain spaces, depending on who's in them and if they judge me to be, you know, authentic or not authentic and all of these things. So the book for me was really, as I said, that part of it, as you asked before, was any of this, you know, autobiographical. And I said, yeah, and I said, you know, this particular part of it is, and not in exact things that happen, but rather in the idea that one is dealing with or querying, you know, the pros and cons, you know, between going one way versus another. Because in the book, I don't really say going the traditional way is wrong. You know, I don't say going to a hospital is wrong. Instead, I deal with the character's angst regarding, you know, his place in the world based on these choices, you know, and where he finds himself and tries to locate himself. I don't know if that's
Yes, it makes sense. And as I was reading the book, I thought anyone of any race can relate to this. It's not a book or a novel or a story that only an African person or a Black African person can relate to. It's a story. It just so happens that the vehicle that you use is a Xhosa man. But I think men of all races can relate to the struggle to figure out manhood and how to get to that ideal manhood for yourself, whatever you regard as that manhood for yourself. How do you get there? What do you have to go through to get there? So yes.
I suppose you even have to have an ideal manhood. For other people, there is not even, you know, that ideal manhood. You know what I mean? There's no ideal picture. There's no, that's the kind of man I would like to represent, because I think that's what ideal sort of says. It says, you know, there's a level to which you aspire, right? And so perhaps this book also says the thing towards which, I mean, the things towards, the things, there goes the English, the thing towards which you aspire, the thing you aspire towards, all right? You know, has to be there. If it's not, then you're not aspiring towards anything. You're sort of lost in the source, as it were. Nagedi, for example, you know, his dad doesn't teach him anything. His dad isn't a man of considerable anything, you know, integrity or whatever, you know, he's somebody who just drinks and wallows in his brokenness. And so Nagedi has no idea of manhood to say, that's the kind of man I would like to be, you know, or, and he's mostly raised by women. I mean, he's got these two sisters, he's got his aunt. Of course, he's got the younger brother, but you can't look to your younger brother or to your younger cousin, you know, for an ideal in manhood, you know. You have to have males who have what do they say in the Zulu or Xhosa proverb that says, Inya tibuzo kwaba phambili.
Yes.
right? As in those who have traveled the distance are able to then turn back and tell the youngsters, what age and wisdom and experience have taught them. And if you don't have these kinds of men or people present within your life, then you don't have that sense of a beacon, or rather a compass, that is going to lead you towards anywhere ideal.
But yes, but I found that very inspiring, because there are many of us who did not have fathers growing up. So you had to create your ideal. You had to figure out, who am I as Mdu, as Litha, as the male that I am, and then what kind of man do I want to be? And then you had to create that for yourself. And so I found it inspired me in that way, that you can create the ideal yourself, because one day I will have children, I will have a son, and then I would like to be able to be that ideal for him. So I'll have to create that for myself, because I don't have it. Litha, I want to move on to the next question, so that we can cover as much of the book without giving away too much, of course. You do also talk about xenophobia in the book. Yes. And then I just want to read a little passage on page 23. So Kele is talking to her friend, or she's talking to herself, and she is a journalist or a radio person. And so this is on page 23. She says she wanted to conduct interviews on how the people of Mandela Spirit felt about foreigners. She would allow them to tell their story without policing their responses with political correctness. She wouldn't even use the word xenophobia. Instead, she would try to get to the bottom of the residents' emotions to tell their stories honestly. She would get the names of those behind the attacks and, if possible, speak to them. Let's see how the night goes, she reassured herself. If it goes well and the big names want to talk, I'll give them a platform and anonymity. That should establish trust between us, as long as I am ready with the people's interviews when the mess starts. And what struck me about this is that particular part about political correctness. Do you think that we are too politically correct in how we speak about the problem of the violence against foreign nationals in South Africa? Should we be calling it xenophobia? How should we speak about it?
Okay, I'm going to have to ask you to repeat that, because the thing sort of went wonky for 2 seconds. I didn't get the full extent of the question. Sorry, Mdu.
The question or the reading?
Okay.
Okay, would you like me to read the question again, or the reading?
No, just the question, Mdu. Just the question, sorry.
Oh, sure. I was saying, how should we speak about the violence against foreign nationals in South Africa? Should we even use the word xenophobia? How should we speak about it?
Again, that's a question that kind of...
I know it's a deep question. Well, you wrote about it.
Well, I suppose the question prompts me to be prescriptive on how we should do things, and who's we. I'm not the voice of the people, and so I don't regard myself as that in terms of being prescriptive in how we should speak about it. As a matter of fact, the xenophobia in the book kind of, it leads in that direction, but doesn't eventually work itself out into xenophobia. So absolutely. I don't necessarily want to speak about, I suppose the only thing I would like to say about xenophobia and South Africans, is something that I find very, very funny. And a brother by the name of Adetunji Amotola, I think you may or may not be aware of him.
Yes, I know him very well.
Yes, he always makes an interesting point about how, there's a group of Black people who still believe that Black people cannot be racist, and I always marvel at the idea that, Black people cannot be racist. Of course, Black people have not been in charge of, or the custodians of, a racist system, or the racist system that, we've known in the world, in South Africa and the world beyond, wherever, there's been colonialism or colonization of peoples. So, but for me, it's always interesting that colorism exists, right? So even before we leave our own ethnic identities, you know, between Xhosa people, you know, the darker you are, the more you are made fun of. You'll go into what are called, you know, mixed race families, which are called colored families.
Mm.
Uh, Colored people not being only mixed race, by the way, because I know its identity is very complex and complicated in South Africa, and sometimes if you just speak as if you know everything, you know, or rather speak as if everything is unified under one term, you know, you get crucified. But the
Absolutely.
idea here is just to show, you know, there's a color grading that, you know, African or even Black people elsewhere work with, you know, where the colorism exists, and you will then find that over and above that colorism, then, you know, certain ethnic groups regard themselves better than certain ethnic groups. For example, you know, a Zulu person versus a Shangaan person, you know, might have some derogatory things to say about a Shangaan person. A Xhosa person may have something derogatory to say about a Zulu person who has not been circumcised, etc.,
Mm.
etc. But what I find with xenophobia is, man, the further north you go, the more South African people feel, you know, that, you know, our North African brothers are less deserving. You know, for me, it's always been an interesting thing how we treat them, the violence against them, the exclusion that we have against them, or we at least try, because some of these people are present in our community. Some of these people marry our sisters. Some of our brothers marry their women. You know, but when it comes to identifying on a broader scale, it's almost like, no, they're Nigerian. Oh, this person is. And when the xenophobic attacks first hit in 2008, you know, for me, it was surprising that Black people could think of themselves as not racist. Meanwhile, they're able to perpetrate perpetrate the kind of violence they perpetrate on darker skinned, you know, brothers and sisters, or even exclude them, or even call them names the way that they do. I mean, if we were white and the people that we perform xenophobic attacks against were Black, and we were white, it would automatically be seen as racism. So I think for me, the idea that at least I wanted to uncover in the book to a certain degree is that, you know, there are human beings, and human
Mm.
beings form themselves into in groups and out groups. You know, you're either with us or you are the other. And in
Mm.
othering people, it allows you easily to then degrade them, you know, berate them for things that they are not responsible for. So one Nigerian guy is selling, you know, drugs in your neighborhood, so all Nigerians are. You know, as a Zimbabwean, you know, has a job that you covet, so all Zimbabweans are taking our jobs. So, and I'm not going to speak statistically here because I don't have all the statistical information in front of me, but I'm speaking purely just on speaking purely around the idea that human beings as a group can oppress another group that
Yes.
looks like them,
Yes.
just because they are of a
Absolutely.
darker color, you know, then it's a then
Yes.
it's a
When
thing that's
people
a,
studied the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, in 1994, there was a genocide in Rwanda where Hutu extremists tried to
Tutsis.
completely kill out the Tutsi population. And these were people who were all, they
Lived
looked
side
the
by
same.
side.
They lived side by
Yeah,
side for centuries.
these were
Absolutely.
neighbors. I mean, I remember watching, and I did a bit of that for some of my varsity work, you know,
Mm.
and I remember listening to some of the interviews and how some of the people were amazed, saying the guy that I saw, you know, with the machete killing people and throwing them in the furrows was actually a neighbor of mine. We'd grown up breaking bread. We'd gone to school together. We'd done all types of things together. But
Mm.
that was the same person to be fearful of in that moment, because as a group,
Mm.
you know,
Yes.
things were being done.
Yes, there's a yes. So that's why identity is very important. And then lastly, because we do have to wrap up, Nagedi, I want us to finish maybe.
We're wrapping up already.
Well, no, we can continue. But I want another element that stands out in this novel is love. Love of thyself, love of the father, love of the brother, love in general. So why was it important for you to include this fatherly love, brotherly love, self-love, especially with someone like Nakedi, who's very complicated and very flawed. Maybe you could say he's very flawed, but he also is yearning for love. He did not have love when he was a child. He didn't have love from his father. He doesn't know who his mother is. He was basically an orphan. He was raised by women, but different kinds of women, more than just one woman. So he was yearning for love. And so maybe it explains why he's so flawed as a man and why he's so complicated as a man, because he's searching for love. So why was it important to include this?
When is it never important to include love? I think it's always important to include love. I like the way that you've posed the question. You know, you talked about brotherly love, you've talked about love of self, and all of that. But I think this novel, more than showing the fullness and presence of love, shows the absence of it and how people are more impoverished for that absence. It shows a yearning for it. So I think this book really is not about presences more than it is about absences of the things that we should have. Love being one of them. As you pointed out, Nagedi doesn't have it, wants it. Kelly grew up in a particular way. She also doesn't have the full love and confidence of her mother and her father. They are more into their Catholicism, more they're into her own wishes and development, etc. But yeah, just to answer you, I mean, it's difficult now to sort of trace where the love goes in the novel, you know, but for his son, Nagedi wants to love his son. He doesn't know how to. You know, there's a time when they're driving into his hometown for the first time together, and I express it as he felt a feeling like, you know, the crashing of 100 dandelions, and I sort of write about him noticing or sort of trying to locate within himself, what's that feeling I'm feeling? And he recognized it, oh, it's love. But the way that he recognizes it allows the reader to realize that, oh, for this guy to recognize it like this means that it's a constant absence. And so when it does sort of show up now and again, he realizes it and says, oh, that's love. That's something he could aspire towards to, but does he have the tools? You know, because this here is a psychology, you know, and once it's been fed, it's like a hard drive, you know, your psyche. Once it's been fed certain things, it's difficult for it to have an output that's different from what it's been programmed with, right? And so though some pop-ups of love may come up in your system, okay, pop up, that's love over there, but you click delete because, you know, you don't know how to deal with that sort of emotional, that sort of love. So it's really a search for the good things, but you will find when you read, the good things are always at arm's length. You know, people try to reach out for them, but it's a novel that I think is more depressing than anything. I don't want to say it that way, like it's depressing. You know, it's hopeful, but at the same time, it shows kind of, I'd say it's always a balancing act of, oh my God, there's a precipice that we are on. And if we don't do anything about the state we are in as human beings internally, then we are bound to fall off this cliff for good. And then there's the other side that says, listen, if you are aware of these things and you want to move towards, and I think that Velelo is that kind of character in the end, because he's probably the one character who is a little more put together, is not as problematic as other characters. And from his perspective, we are able to get more hope, even for our protagonist. But you know, the novel is essentially about a barren land that has a promise of rain if the character just does the right things, you know? I don't know if that sort of explains it right.
That makes sense. In fact, the last paragraph, it says, when the creature had gone under, however, and he and that Mvelelo were already bearing towards the forest, a thought struck Nagedi with a sentiment of completeness, whose sensation he could only liken to a sigh escaping through his body instead of his lips. He remarked how, just like himself and his troubles, the ocean, with all its gigantic creatures, was as small as a mustard seed in the grander scheme of the maker's designs. I thought that was a beautiful way to conclude the story. Nageti, we do have to close. Unfortunately,
Litha,
Litha. I'm sorry, there was a slip of the tongue.
sure.
Yes, we do. And now you reveal the
Yeah, now I go back to myself and step out of character, you know, so for
step
people
out of
to,
character. Yes.
mm,
But all of us do this. You know, Maya Angelou has a poem called The Mask. We
yes,
all wear a mask. The moment you step out of your house, you put on that mask
especially if
because
it's a
it's how you
poet.
say. Especially now, now we literally wear a literal mask. But she was talking about
Yeah.
a figurative mask. Absolutely. And I love what you're doing now because you are showing us those two parts of who you are. And I think that's very, very powerful. And I think it links very well to the story that you've written in this novel. And now we see, is this the real Litha?
Oh, well, listen, there's another mask I can take off, but I'll keep it on.
Litha, what would you like people to feel as they are reading this novel? I'm someone who likes feelings. What do you want us to feel?
Um, Listen, I suppose there's always the vanity of a writer.
Mm,
So I'd like somebody to pick up my book and feel like they made a good decision in picking up that book.
mm,
Meaning when they're reading it, they should, as you said in the beginning, feel like they can't put it down. They should feel like it's easy to access what the book is talking about. It's easy to go from page to page, from chapter to chapter. And once you put it down, you must feel like I've just gone through something, you know, meaningful. In fact, Geraldine Fenn, a friend who's a jeweler, who was once a tutor of mine when I was back in my undergrad. She's one of those people. Before I had readers, you know, I sent her some of my stuff, which was different from what the novel eventually became. But I remember her reading one of my short stories and coming back to me and saying, "Litha, do you know how I know you're a good writer?" I said, "How?" She said, "I finished reading your story about a week ago, but I'm still thinking about your character in my head unprompted." And so I would like for readers to pick up the book and enjoy the book for being a good book.
yes.
However, I would also like for people to read the book, particularly people who were like me, who may have you know, reservations about their own identity, etc. I'd like, you know, single women who are the fathers, sorry, who are the, well, mothers and fathers of boys, you know, to pick it up, to sort of glean a little bit about the complexity of you know, of manhood, or rather just, you know, boys growing up without their dads and sort of what they go through in a psyche. It's also for young boys themselves, who may read and find something in there, something that says, "Oh, that's me. Oh, but this guy's life is better here. Or if I don't do that, you know, I could skip this sort of heartache, or, you know, hamstringing myself in this particular area." But essentially, you know, I would like whoever reads the book to sort of leave with a certain amount of hope, but also with a certain amount of discomfort that says, what world are we living in? You know, but also being aware that that world could be something better. You know, so I've been always been asked. So once a person puts the book down, what feeling do you want them to get? I want them to leave with a feeling of extreme discomfort, but also a feeling of fullness and a feeling of hope. Yeah, I think those are three things that I would like readers to leave with.
I think we should end it there. I think that's a perfect way to end it. Litha, thank you.
Mdu, thank you very, very much for your time.
It was my pleasure.
And yeah.
The Eyes of the Naked by Litha Hermanus, a novel. Thank you very much for joining us.